So could you talk a little bit about the linguistic challenges of translating, and then maybe also give people a sense of the issues of collation and editing of the 8 manuscripts that we have, each of which has its problems, and the one you used has very particular and frustrating problems that anybody who knows, works with this text knows all too well.
Right. Well, this is a very difficult text to translate, and it took 10 years in total, including 1 year on an NEH fellowship. It was all supported by an ACLS Luce grant, which let me run a reading workshop in Missoula, Montana, which you would hope to be at, I recall. That workshop was really interesting because, well, you couldn't be there for very good reasons.
Yeah.
I wish you'd been there because you really know these genres well. And look, I brought together some of the greatest experts on reading Central Asian Turkic languages in the world. And we sat down at a table and a bunch of us went, what? Because it's actually a really hard text to read. Its diction is strange. Its grammar is a little strange because it's sort of in the classical languages of Central Asia, but it's also quite idiosyncratic. And I think over time I've come to realize that, no, is it sophisticated? You know, when I originally started reading this text, it was with Wheeler Thaxton, the great, translator of Persian and Chaghatay literature, who you also studied with. And his opinion was that this text is really unsophisticated garbage.
Interesting.
As compared to a lot of Central Asian work. And I think that comes from a sense that, Sayrami's diction goes from really highfalutin to really, really simple and back and forth over and over again. And sometimes he mixes his metaphors. And sometimes he doesn't quite remember the right set phrase to use, at least as we would know it in the other side of the mountains, as you say, Central Asia. So he seems kind of rustic, but he's also clearly very educated. The man had a very good Madras education, and he read a lot of other chronicles. So part of it is that it's very uneven. He draws on other texts, he quotes things here and there. Sometimes he speaks very, very plainly, and sometimes he speaks in extremely fancy and complex register. The one sentence at one point took me, over the course of years, several days of going back to it over and over again to figure out exactly what he was doing with his complex grammar. It's hard to translate. The thing that helped me most when translating was reading Shakespeare and reading George Eliot. And George Eliot, wonderful.
Why is that?
Because so Shakespeare has a sort of epic quality to it. So Macbeth was on my mind a lot during this. And actually, at one point, I used Macbeth to translate something. And Shakespeare has that sort of epic rhythmic diction, which is simultaneously poetic and elevated, but also comprehensible to a broader audience, which is the point of Shakespeare in its original context, right? But then George Eliot has this wonderful way, this is a woman writer from the 19th century, she has this wonderful way of writing about British society, which is also what Sayrami is doing. He's very ethnographic. He's writing about society in a way. But she uses these wonderful sentences that seem to have complex and obscure metaphors and yet pinpoint exactly the meaning that she wants. And Sayrami's overly complex sentences are often doing the exact same thing. He'll have a strange extended metaphor that at first seems impenetrable, obscure, idiosyncratic, but it's actually narrowing down precisely what he wants to say. And so I was working between these two very different authors to capture different sides of Sayrami's voice. And that helped me a lot, rather than reading like 𝗶ሔር𝗳𝗺𝗁 or something, which is, I think, what I read when I was writing my book. So that helped tremendously. Linguistically, it took many, many years to get used to Sayrami's diction, and I now find anything else I read to be quite easy in comparison. One of the issues he has is that he frequently uses Chinese words. And if you read a Chinese word in Arabic, it's very confusing, right? Because you don't have the character to read, right? You just have the phonetics. And you have to, what the hell is he talking about? Right? And you have to work backwards through that. That's a huge part of the challenge. So he clearly knew some Chinese, and he assumed that his audience would as well, right? And that they'd recognize it in context. But as a modern person, I had to go through the documentary record quite thoroughly and look at what were normal people writing about the Chinese administration. What was the vocabulary in Chinese that a normal Uyghur person would know at the dawn of the 20th century to understand the limits of his vocabulary, what he's talking about.
And then you're reading all of this from what is essentially a very blurry photocopy.
Very blurry photocopy.
Of a manuscript written in a very cramped hand.
Yes.
I mean, just the number of letters across the horizontal space. It's very tight.
It's very
Why
tight,
did you
and
choose this really illegible? It's not entirely illegible. At least the script is like regular. The person knows what they're doing, whoever copied
Yeah.
this manuscript. But I mean, it is so cramped and tight.
cramped.
How did you end up with that, and how did you survive it?
Yeah, no, to be clear, this is a printout of a scan of a printout of a microfilm made from photos of a manuscript. And there might be some other steps in there as well. It's really blurry and it's really lossy. Yeah, this is a problem. There are places where clearly someone else has tried to correct it with ballpoint pen, which is a problem. There are pages missing as well. I eventually found almost all the missing pages. And I was able to consult with the modern Uyghur translations made from the same version of the text, which helped me figure out what was happening in other places. So if something was unclear from this text, I had many other places to turn.